There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms, and I've got, again, Nephi Cole.
Nice to be here.
And Mike McGrady.
Still here.
And as we're about to jump in to this episode, I got to thinking that we should change up our intro just a little bit. You know, that instead of our normal intro with the person running through the woods and the elk, chasing the bugle and elk, that maybe this one would be the highwayman. I'm thinking because we're going to talk really in this episode. We're going to talk about the story. Like the story of our public lands, and what better intro about the story of our public lands than a little Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, right? And who else is in the Highwaymen? But
you need a life preserver?
Yeah, help me out.
I like your shirt, man. Looks good. It's got some Wyoming cowboy shirts going on.
I do.
It's fitting. We are in the West.
We're going to
talk about public lands, which is like a volatile topic.
Yeah, so we have 640 million acres of public land in the United States. And we hear discussions about it at the federal level, at the state level. You have one camp that just advocates for public lands, protect these public lands. They belong to us. They don't belong. They don't belong to the government. They belong to the people, right? The government is holding these lands in trust for the people. Then you have another camp that's, kind of in the federal government has had these lands long enough. They're too big. It's too bureaucratic. It can be managed better by either states or individuals. Yeah. Right. We're not going to get into the politics of that. But because those politics are out there, and they've been out there for generations, and they're going to continue to be out there for generations, we thought it might be fun to go as quickly as we could with this podcast and run through the history of how we got to where we are today with public lands.
I think it's fascinating because Nephi said, hey, that we're in the West and the public land issues are important. I grew up in Florida, and we didn't have a lot of public land. And in getting ready for this, I was sort of fascinated to learn what the public land makeup looked like and all the issues that we see today existed in the original 13 colonies and the founding of the country. So
we know you guys are going to want to go to war with each other on this. We're going to give each side some ammunition. We're going to load you guys up. So now or at least
explain how we got here.
That's right. We're going to talk about where it came from. What are the arguments? Why they exist?
Right. And I think and Mike, you were alluding to this. I think as I was preparing for this, one of the most fascinating things, and I learned a lot. And this sort of falls into the did you know camp, right? The did you know that all of the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi were once owned by the 13 original states, right?
Right. Yeah. I'm sure I learned it at some point, but it didn't really dawn on me that it went from the coast to the Mississippi, right?
But how long ago was that? I mean, that was pre.
At the founding of the country. So the late 1700s.
Yeah, so right. I mean, we're talking pre.
Right.
Yeah.
So the Articles of Confederation.
That's right.
About that time frame that was being ratified.
Yep.
In the founding of the country. Yeah,
so the original 13 colonies.
Yeah.
Right.
So they had this, and at some point, starting in 1781 and going through 1802, in a series of land acquisitions, those 13 states ceded title to more than 40%. It was 237 million acres of land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River to the federal government. Mm-hmm. And for what purpose? I mean, I think this is the part that's fascinating to me, right? There was a specific reason why they did this.
So this was part of the original deal, correct? I mean, this is like our country's founded.
Not the New Deal, the original deal?
The original deal.
Not the Green New Deal, not the New Deal, but the
When we're deciding what the country is going
deal.
to look like, this issue came up. when we're talking about like how's the United States going to grow?
How are we going to grow?
Yeah, talk about it.
Yeah, look, how do we want to? Okay, so how do we want to talk about that? I mean, basically, it was. So
how do you birth a state?
How do you? Yeah, right.
Yep.
How's a state created?
Dive in.
Right.
Mike, you dive into that because you explained that to me before we started this pretty well.
I did. Okay.
I thought you did. If I just
so
pushed you in front of the bus, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So essentially, we had the states that were originally part of the colonies. That the landmass went from the ocean to the Mississippi, and at some point they ceded the land that went from the Appalachian Mountains essentially to the Mississippi.
Not all of it.
But
40% of it. Right. 237 million acres.
Right.
Yeah.
So
a lot.
It was a lot, and they ceded that to the United States, so that
to the federal government, the new federal government.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Which had huge debt from a Revolutionary War.
Yep.
Had needs of raising revenues, paying off or paying back, a better way to say it, Revolutionary War soldiers and things like that. But under the Constitution, there are provisions that essentially have mechanisms for creating new states.
Mm-hmm.
States can't create their own states within a state. It has to be sort of seeded out back and bilateral agreement between the federal government and then the state, the legislatures of the state. And so you can create these new areas, and essentially that's how we have Tennessee, Kentucky, a lot of those more interior states, right?
Like the thing that maybe surprised me the most is, and I should have known this, and I just didn't. And so I'm owning up the fact that I never knew this, that at the inception of the country, the federal government did not own land in the original states of the Union. Like, federal government was not a landholder. Right?
Yeah, except for this. I mean, gets argued about, right? This little mountain. It's like, yeah, the federal government, you can own 10 square miles or whatever it is. It's like.
Well, now you're throwing me for a
Well,
loop,
the 10 square miles has to do with the concept of there would be the district.
That's right.
Of Columbia, right?
Yeah.
But then
that's the carve out that everybody goes back to, and they're like, see, that's all you get.
Right, but there's also the property clause, the enclave clause, the help me out here. There's like the military establishments and
right, and there's
Navy
the equal footing doctrine, right?
Right.
Yeah. But like we were saying, so the federal government didn't own land of the original states. The original states ceded their land to the federal government to allow for the creation of new states pursuant to the Constitution and the way that states had to be, could become states, right? As you described.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, and just to put a finer point on it, in 1780, the Continental Congress, when they established the Articles of Confederation, did have a provision within the Articles of Confederation that described when the Confederate of states, when they get land, what was going to happen? How were they going to dispose of it? What would they do with that? And so even as of 1780, they were talking about the disposal of the common lands just kind of that it needs to be done in order for the benefit of everybody. But when we create these new states, they're going to come in and have that equal footing, as Dave was mentioning. The idea that every new state, even though they were not one of the original 13, they're just as good if they're number 14 or they're number 50.
Or number 44.
That's right.
Look it up. All right. So before we talk, because I do want to talk about that, I think we want to talk about the methods of disposal, because that's a big part of American federal land ownership is disposal of federal lands as well. But before we get there, let's complete this discussion about acquisition. So we know that the first foray into the federal government acquiring lands was this time frame between 1781 and 1802, and then 1803 happened, right?
Yeah, a notable year.
Just a little thing that one Thomas Jefferson sends Ben Franklin to France to negotiate with Napoleon, and just like that. More than doubles the size of the United States with the 530 million acre Louisiana Purchase, right? New federal land.
Well done, Ben.
And then also, fast forward another decade or so, and you have treaties with Great Britain and Spain adding another 76 million acres, and then you have other acquisitions, totaling 620 million acres, that happened via purchases and treaties between the years of 1846 and 1853, and so the land mass continues to grow, and the last major acquisition by the federal government was when they purchased Alaska in 1867. That was another 378 million acres. So at that point, we're looking at a federal government that owns 1.8 billion acres in North America. 1.8 billion. And you put that in context with today, what I said at the beginning, right? So we have 640 million acres today. But at one point, there were 1.8 billion acres.
Yeah, so we got rid of, or we disposed of 1.2 billion, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the next piece of this is, so we disposed of it. How? And how did we do it, and why did we do it? Because I think those are both interesting, the rationale behind both of those. The how we did it, and then the why we did it that way. The why is maybe more interesting than the how.
Yeah.
And then the who's on first.
Let's
Well,
not go there.
yeah, right. So, it's worth noting that land disposals was from the beginning. The 1785, the original land ordinance. They were using mechanisms to dispose through legislation. They were a lot of it had to do with they first needed to get surveys done. They were reserving back one section, which would be a 640 acre piece, 1/36th of a 6 mile square township, in order to sort of reserve back for the United States a piece, or for a particular state to maintain schools. So that was occurring in the late 1700s. And as we're getting these acquisitions, at some point in time, it's not expedient for the Congress to get together to do legislation for all of these disposals. So in 1800, the Land Office comes into being, and that really was that 1800 was the first time they needed to figure out what was going on with a particular land title going from the United States to private hands. And I think that was in Ohio, and then
and then you had
really expanded from there.
Yeah, and
snowballed.
And when you talk about the Lands Office, right, the 1800 you're talking about is specific to Ohio, but the General Lands Office for the whole U.S. was 1812 to administer the disposal of federal lands. Right, they realized, it's a big job to unload 1.2 billion acres of federal land.
Well, I want to back up just a little bit from my perspective, trying to look at this from top of the mountain. We had a country at the time, right, that was land rich and capital, and cash poor.
You're right.
And so a lot of cases, we had all this land. The U.S. government was trying to find ways to use that land, whether it be to pay for things, to pay for work to get done, to pay for expansion,
to pay for soldiers to fight in the Revolutionary War. I mean, some of the first land sales were to pay for soldiers to fight in the Revolutionary War.
It's not only that. I mean, obviously we were land rich, cash poor, but in order for us to really perfect the title on that land and to establish ourselves as a dominant country, we had to get through and essentially go in and settle it to stake out our claim.
Well, and that was, in particular, you hear that argument, well, not really argument, but that position, right, a lot when we talk about the Western United States.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
and really, and when you look at like the Homestead Act in 1862, I mean, the purpose of the Homestead Act is we need to encourage settlement of the West. And the way to do that is to incentivize folks to move west by saying that you go there and you live and work that ground for a certain period of time, it's yours. Government will give you title to it. It's yours.
Well, Lewis and Clark, I mean, that's for purposes of commerce. I mean, that's what they were doing, is they were heading up these stretches of river to basically say this is an area that we utilize for the commerce of this country. And they were mapping the borders of the resources that they were going to extract.
Yeah.
Our country was going to extract.
Well, and we did other things too. So we had, like you mentioned, Nephi, right? So you said land rich, cash poor. So we had to sell land to raise capital. We had to sell land to incentivize. In fact, it wasn't even just selling land. In a lot of cases, it was gifting land to settle. Settle the West, settle the interior part of the country, to allow for commerce to expand across the country. Other things we had to do to allow that settlement to occur. We granted large tracts of land to the railroads in the 1870s to be able to have the transcontinental railroad.
How are we paying them? So basically, helping them finance building this highway of commerce that we needed in order to be, a great nation. And again, land rich, cash poor.
Right. So here's kind of how all these pieces played out. Right. So between 1781 and 2006, because why wouldn't we stop this 14 years ago or 13 years ago, right? Yeah. It's not going to change much between 2006 and the present. So basically say between 1781 and today, about 816 million acres of federal land were transferred to private ownership in the various ways that we've described, and for various reasons. Most of that, 97% of that, occurred before the year 1940. So almost all of this was done from the time we settled the country until 1940. And then you have, like, for example, the Homestead Act in 1862, where people are flooding west to stake out their piece of paradise. Well, that peaked in 1910. In 1910, that particular year, 18.3 million acres under the Homestead Act settled in the West, right, claimed in the West. But then after that, after 1935, we were at like 200,000 acres. And it's because at some point, at least in the western United States, at some point with this Homestead Act, right, all the good stuff was taken.
I mean,
right?
I was going to actually ask that question. I mean, if you want to drive through the West and you wonder why, when you're going to your favorite antelope hunting spot, how come all the wet meadows are private and all of the badlands aren't?
Yeah, that's exactly why.
It's because you're not growing anything on those badlands.
Yeah.
And so if you could grow something, if you could scratch out a living somewhere, and there were people that could, make a go of it, they were already doing it.
Well, you also have to take into account that at that time, so the federal government has a bunch of the land, and then homesteading comes into being, and so they're granting to the individuals. But at the same time, we have territories that are becoming states, and when they get their statehood, they are being granted state lands.
So that's the other piece.
Right, that's the other piece.
That's another 328 million acres of this 1.2 billion that was disposed.
Given to states.
Right? That's right.
Was land given to the states. Right?
Exactly.
So we have, exactly.
Do you know? Do we know how much of that remains in state controls?
Oh, that's
a really different day.
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. Okay. I don't know the answer to that.
Don't go hunt for it now.
I won't hunt for it right now. Yeah, that's something.
It's fair, so Dave was mentioning 328 million acres. I mean, but it's fair to say that wasn't by 1935, right? That had also to do with Alaska.
Oh yeah, Alaska's a big chunk.
Yeah, that's like a third of that number is Alaska.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
And that didn't, just to be clear, that wasn't until late 1950s, right? 1958.
Right, when 103 million acres were given to Alaska.
Right.
That's right. And that would have been at 1958 would have been Alaska statehood, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's exactly. So that's where we were, and that kind of takes you up to about the middle part of the 20th century, right? So we had this massive land acquisition, and then we worked pretty hard at disposal for various reasons to pay off our national debt, from things like paying off our national debt and paying soldiers fighting in wars, to
multiple wars, right?
multiple
Civil
wars.
War, yeah,
You got it.
yeah, and all those, and Industrial Revolution occurring, transcontinental railroads coming into being,
right, and then
agricultural land taken up. So now we're at the point where suddenly we've taken all the land up, we figured out what to do with it, and we develop an environmental ethos.
Yeah, and that, yeah. When did that environmental ethos start? You could say maybe 1872-ish. Sort of backtracking a little bit because we still have all this land disposition, or we're getting rid of this land, until the mid part of the 20th century. But we also had these other things going on with the federal government as they were actively disposing of lands, and they were actively trying to dispose of lands, and they had a policy to do that. Mm-hmm. They also started to develop a second policy of retaining certain lands for certain purposes.
Which is called something weird that is hard to get your head around.
What is it?
A withdrawal.
The withdrawal, yeah.
Right? So a federal land withdrawal is not that they're withdrawing it from someone coming in and
they're withdrawing
buying
it from being able to
or
be disposed
developing
of.
it. Yeah, right.
They're saying this is no longer considered. Somebody can no longer get this. We're going to withdraw that from public consideration for being something you can have.
So you're not withdrawing it from the use of the public, although sometimes it is certain uses. You can withdraw it from mineral entry, which in and of itself doesn't sound right either. It just means you can't go in there and enter into it and extract. We're withdrawing you from having that ability. So I just think it's a weird term that doesn't convey what
you're actually doing,
or what I intellectually think is going on here.
Yeah, and when
I kind of like it because I think it does give that frame of reference that when you consider where they were at the time, it was just this idea of you were just getting rid of it. You're trying to find ways for people to make use of it. That withdrawal was just saying this is important enough to us that we're going to withdraw this from you guys being able to take it, use it for something else.
And the reason I said 1872 is that's the year Yellowstone.
Oh, I was going to say Jellystone.
Jellystone. But that's the year Yellowstone National Park became Yellowstone National Park, first national park, and it was the first pulling this land back and saying, there's some places that we probably shouldn't dispose of.
Yeah. Now, just to be 100% technically clear, they were withdrawing other lands and using for other purposes all the way back to the late 1700s, but it would be isolated incidents of we need this magazine fortification for military purposes, or we need this
for a base.
Right, something specific and isolated, but it wasn't a programmatic or formulated. We are going to withdraw this for the grand public use,
right?
Like Yellowstone. That was huge.
That was huge, and then fast forward, and you have in 1891, you have the creation of the National Forest System, which, really that was set up at the time to be more of a set this aside to protect the resource, to make sure that it's used in a renewable way.
Yeah.
The idea was
there's a forest to harvest.
We want to have a forest to
now.
Harvest. Exactly. That was the whole idea behind it, right? We want to be able to have a managed forest. Right?
Let's protect it so we can cut it down and use it to build. Yeah,
but in a sustainable way.
Right.
That was the idea. Was it needed to be a renewable resource, and it was best. The view was it was best if that was a reservation of land still controlled by the federal government to make sure that it could be a renewable resource for the country to build homes and particularly homes, but and have fuel and all the things that we needed for our society.
It really is sort of amazing when you think about originally we were holding back the lands, we were establishing ourselves as a country, we were so indebted to all of the things that were necessary to set up the country. And within 100 years, suddenly we have the wherewithal to be able to say, you know what? I want a place to relax.
Yeah, maybe not all of it. Maybe,
right? When you think about it, it's like we need to recreate.
We work hard, we play hard.
Yeah, right.
Well, it's important for people to remember that when you look at these things, Dave, you talked about and then we changed our mind. Well, the reality is that there are these competing interests. It's not like when you say that the government decided to do this. We're not talking about one individual with a unified mind here, or even multiple agencies that are necessarily always moving the same direction. You're talking about individuals, you're talking about agencies with different charges, individuals in Congress or in the presidency with different priorities.
Mm-hmm.
There's a constant struggle that was going on even then from people who wanted to use a piece of land A in one way and people who wanted to use it in a different way.
A lot of it was actually at the discretion of the president in the 1800s. A lot of it was. Or sometimes it would be the Secretary of War, because that's what we used to call it. And the Secretary of War would have discretion over a lot of the things that we now think of as forests because of the military sort of needs for those things. And there would be all kinds of different land transfers within federal decisions.
Yeah, because there are individuals and private interests who are there or who are lobbying for different uses in a different area. And it continues today.
It does. And let's talk about that some. Because so fast forward to the middle part of the 20th century. Right? And as I mentioned, things like the Homestead Act, the folks moving west and trying to homestead, stake their claim to their what was 160, 180 acres. Now I'm forgetting; it's kind of late, but
160.
Stake their claim to that. 120? No, whatever it was.
It was 160 because individuals 80 acres for an individual, right? But if you're married, you get 160.
That might be right. In any event, people were coming out and doing that, right? But by the 1930s, all the good stuff, like you mentioned, all the irrigable land, all the stuff that was productive, had already been settled, and so it was grinding to a halt. The disposition of federal lands was really grinding to a halt, and then there was this cultural change a little bit as far as the view. The economy was growing. The country was it was becoming a world power, right? It was it didn't need to dispose of federal lands to pay debts. We won't talk about debts of today, right?
Yeah,
but
right.
It didn't need to do that, right? And so there started to be this collective thought of, well, maybe there's some value in maintaining what we have left of these federal lands and keeping them in federal control. And you started to see little, first cuts at this with like the Taylor Grazing Act, saying, okay, if we're going to have these, we should be managing these in a way that's effective, that allows for sustainable use of the landscape and reduces resource damage. And that was kind of the Taylor Grazing Act. And you move forward from that, and we hit the 1970s, and I know there's some other acts before this. I don't know if we need to talk about them all. The big one really is the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, right? FLPMA.
We finally got that right.
Got it right.
I don't know how many episodes.
I don't know, 2 or 3 times we messed it up.
It's me. Yeah.
But 1976, Congress passes FLPMA, and FLPMA formally ends the disposal policy, and it expressly declares that the national policy generally was to retain the remaining lands in federal ownership. I say generally because there are parts of FLPMA that allow for disposition of federal lands, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like that you can't still dispose of federal lands. There aren't ways to do it, but there's a very specific process and specific reasons that have to be identified before a disposal can occur. The policy is to maintain these lands unless you can show a compelling reason why you shouldn't. Right? I mean, maybe I'm not looking at that the right way, but that's kind of the way I read it. That's what FLPMA did. Am I wrong about that, Mike?
No, you're not.
Okay. All right. So that's 1976. That's a pretty big policy shift from what we'd been doing for the prior, 200 years of our nation's history.
Mm-hmm.
We went from acquiring and then disposing to saying maintain. We're going to maintain, and that's a gigantic. I don't think you can overstate how gigantic of a policy shift that really is.
No, it's huge. And one might imagine that if you were one of those people that didn't get in on the early opportunity on that, where suddenly you're like, well, wait a minute, where's mine? Like,
yeah. So you've heard.
You might have somebody get angry about it.
And I think what's amazing too is that you have such a long history of okay, we're getting as much land as we can, and then we're going to dispose of it internally as much as we can, and then we're kind of looking at ways to sort of preserve some of it, but we still have a grander scheme of things. And at some point, Congress establishes a commission to look into all this, and within a couple of years, they're able to put forth a bunch of recommendations, and within a couple of years, Congress actually
adopted.
passes. Yeah,
like how did it happen?
And not just passes something, but passes something that's a 200-year policy shift in 2 years.
Yeah.
Right?
So in 1964, they established a Public Land Law Review Commission, right? And there's all kinds of blue ribbon panels done all the time, but they came up with 137 legal and policy recommendations by 1970, and by God, we got FLPMA.
And it's worth noting that this is the same time frame where we got the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. These
National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act. You name it.
Yep. They all came in that same decade-ish period of time, and they're all born of the same kind of ethos.
Right.
That's what I said.
The ethos, the environmental ethos that Mike brought up.
Yep.
We've used ethos now a bunch of times in this podcast. That's the word of the day. We're like Sesame Street now for podcasts.
I'm so tired.
I don't know.
Pee-wee's Playhouse.
Yeah,
Maybe.
but here's the other piece. So you've heard of the Sagebrush? I don't know how much we've talked about the Sagebrush Rebellion on this podcast. Maybe a little bit, not much.
I think we covered a little bit with Braden Shepard.
Maybe early on.
Very early on.
So some people got really grumpy.
But the Sagebrush Rebellion is, at its root, you can really trace it to the passage of FLPMA.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the idea behind the Sagebrush Rebellion is that the federal government shouldn't be owning all these lands. That was never their intent. They were never intended to do that in the first place. They shouldn't be the ones controlling or managing all these lands. And it was really a rise up against FLPMA.
And it was led in these states that were again where the disposal had occurred across the Midwest, right? In a lot of these places, everything had already gone out to private hands.
Oh yeah.
And so suddenly you had like FLPMA, which is put on the brakes, and then that rebellion. It's not like it was people in Iowa that were leading the Sagebrush Rebellion.
Yeah. It was largely you had 11 Western states that had the bulk of the BLM land, Bureau of Land Management land. They managed 258 million acres of that federal land, 40% of all federal land, and
it's
good
fair
portion
to say
of it
it's
is
the states that had
the states that had wet drainages and arid everything else.
BLM enforcers.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and they're also the ones that kind of came at the tail end of the door closing on disposal, right?
Yeah.
And so they feel like, well, wait a minute, where was our opportunity to sell off these lands?
And they've said that. I mean, Utah in particular has said, what about the equal footing doctrine? You let everybody else, push this land that was federal out into private ownership. How come we don't get to do it? What's the deal here?
Right. And so states, it wasn't just in the Sagebrush Rebellion, it wasn't just individuals that were pushing back on this idea. States were pushing back on this idea. States were actually their legislatures were passing laws that were saying, no, we're the true trustees or owners of this land, not the federal government. And they were testing the authority of the federal government and the constitutional authority of the federal government to own these lands. It was ultimately settled by federal courts that said exactly what we talked about early on, that the property clause of the Constitution in particular allows for the federal government to own these properties, or own this land, right? But that was more than 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And we're still, it's
Well,
still a sore spot for a lot of people
It comes
today.
back, right? Every time that the cycle usually goes like this. Somebody gets into power who manages those lands. You don't like some of the decisions that they make, and so you say, I don't like the decisions that they make, so I think a different government entity should be in charge of those lands, the states.
Right.
And so, to me, that's the cycle that you see. You see the cycle it's almost a political cycle, and it comes, it swings every so often. It comes back around. In fact, very humorous conversation. Former Senator Al Simpson was talking about the Sagebrush Rebellion, from the early 80s when it was, and he said, I thought we got through this. Usually when the horse dies, you just get off. And
yeah, intimating that perhaps
we're back on this thing.
Or we're beating a dead horse.
Yes.
Yeah, something like that. Maybe we are, but remember, we had a policy that of disposing of these lands for 200 years, and it shifted pretty quickly to this policy of maintaining it. There's, what's to say that we won't be in a situation where folks will rally around enough and there'll be enough momentum to say, you know what, I think the policy of the federal government should be disposing of these lands again. I mean, it's not
out of the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
And that's what scares people about it, I think.
Exactly.
And that's why some groups have made it very, it's part of their ethos, right? To just be like, we're going to be on top of this forever. We're going to stay on top of this. This is the reason that we exist as a group, because of these things.
Yeah. But for whatever reason, for whatever camp you are, those of you listening are in, whether you're in that camp of, you'd rather see states controlling the land, or even the individual controlling the land, or you prefer to stay in federal hands. That's not really relevant. We're not arguing that. But hopefully, you're as fascinated as we are about the history of how we got where we are. How did we go from 13 colonies ceding land to the between the Appalachians and the Mississippi to the federal government to be able to establish new states, and how we get from that and further acquisitions to be able to put the puzzle pieces of this country together, and then go to the point of having 1.8 billion acres of federal land, and then go through this disposition of federal lands over the course of 200 years to get to where we are today, of about 640 million acres of federal land, with a federal policy of maintaining that land in federal control. And I just think the history behind it all is pretty fascinating and warranted spending a little bit of time walking through.
Agreed.
Fair enough.
Yep.
You guys have any other last thoughts on this?
But it just spins off a bunch of other podcasts we could do. and I mean, because it could be, we didn't really get into the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act and how that really kind of came into be, or impact sort of the ongoing perpetual management of these lands. We could have gotten into more on what were the arguments of the Sagebrush Rebellion in the late 70s, early 80s. We could have done a lot of different things. And so I'm kind of curious from the listeners, is there something about this that you guys are aware of?
If you want to know more about it, let us know what we need to talk
that
about.
we could dive into. Yeah, speak up.
I mean, do you want to have an entire podcast on the Louisiana Purchase and the history of that?
Or the Treaty of Hidalgo.
Whatever you want, we can come up with, right? And we
the
didn't
Treaty
even,
of
we
Guadalupe.
didn't-
Please don't send any of those emails.
and we never even talked about the other aspect of this, which was treaties between the federal government and tribes establishing reservations.
Oh yeah,
and how that fits into all of this. So yeah, Mike, I think that's a great question to pose. If folks have ideas, spin-offs that they'd like to hear, questions that come out of this podcast that they'd like a deeper dive on, boy, we'd love to do something like that. We'll do some research and do another podcast.
Just email Dave.
On a piece
He'll send
of this.
you your own.
Yeah.
And so where would he email that?
I think he would email. You'd send that email to Your Mountain at
itsyourmountain.com.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And we respond to every email we get. So please.
We're
send
not going to do a
along your
deeper
feedback.
dive on this.
No, there's pieces of this we can do a deeper dive on. I think there are. There's some unanswered questions
we'll be
here.
Like, you'll think this is fascinating for weeks on end, and everyone else will just. We'll have zero listeners for the next month.
I think we could find some fascinating stories about different aspects of this. Just the history behind this. So
it is important. I mean, you're right, and it's important to know that it's there, and to know that these. It's complex, Dave.
It's complicated.
What do you say?
It's challenging.
It's a challenging issue.
It's a challenging issue.
It's a challenging issue.
I'm going to write that down.
Yeah, it's a challenging issue.
It is.
Yeah, you should write that down. I don't know why we can't remember that. He says it every single episode. It's a challenging issue.
I'm going to make a T-shirt that says quote.
Yeah.
No, we're not going to be the
DeFi quote.
podcast
No,
that
we're
invents
not gonna-
T-shirts.
Anyway,
It's taken.
that's what we've got for today. So, hey, thanks everybody for listening. Hope you learned something here. Like both Nephi and Mike said, if you have questions, follow-ups, shoot us an email at yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com. And as always, remember that life is about experiences, so go have one.